In the letter to the church of Ephesus, there's a clear warning, and it says, I have somewhat against thee. You've left your first love. So what does this mean? This is something that has been echoed in the Old Testament, in the law of Moses that he gave us. This is found in Deuteronomy chapter 6 as the first and greatest commandment, not only by the mouth of Moses, but also by Jesus himself. And it originates in chapter 6 of Deuteronomy. Take a look.
Verse 4, Hear, O Israel, Yehovah is our God, Yehovah is one. And thou shalt love Yehovah thy God with all thine heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy might. And these words that I command thee this day shall be in thine heart.
The first and greatest commandment is that we should love Yehovah our God with all our heart, our soul, and our might. And to show that, we should be keeping his commandments. That's how we can show our love. And that is the greatest commandment. And again, like I said before, this is what Jesus echoed as well, and this is what Jesus is echoing in the church of Ephesus about the first love. Take a look at what Jesus says.
Matthew 22, verse 36 says, Master, which is the greatest commandment in the law? Jesus said unto him, Thou shalt love Yehovah thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, and with all thy mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like unto it. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets.
Now, I've touched on this before, how that most English translations have replaced God's name with Lord in a generic term. And they've done this in all but a few places. But just so you can take a look and see what I'm talking about, you can take a look at just 3 examples off the top of my head in Exodus chapter 6, verse 3, when he's addressing Pharaoh, Psalm chapter 83, verse 18, and Isaiah chapter 26, verse 4. You can take a look at those 3 and see examples where they did not remove the name of God from the text, and instead of placing Lord as generic in all capitals, they left it intact. But this is what Jesus is alluding to, and this is what is being alluded to in this letter to Ephesus, is that we have left our first love. We have forgotten our first love. Just as the rich young ruler in Matthew chapter 19 and in other places had done all the commandments except for the ones that pertain to love of God. If you notice in Matthew chapter 19, the rich young ruler, when he's presented and he says, what should I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus says to keep the commandments. And he says, which ones? And he lists all the commandments that he should follow that have to do with loving your neighbor as yourself. But the ones that he left out were the ones that the rich young ruler had not taken hold of yet. That is what this illusion is. And this is what the problem is with most churches, is that they do love their neighbor as themselves. They do great work in helping other people with their issues and being a ministry to other people throughout the world. But the one thing that they lack is they've left their first love, and that is Yehovah, and keeping the commandments that pertain to loving him. And things of that nature would be things like keeping his Sabbaths that he gave. That is the proof that he gave us that we should use for all generations and a perpetual covenant to prove that Yehovah is our God and that he is the one that sanctifies us. We should always be aware of the problems with prosperity, as when we become rich, we think that it's of our own doing, and then we forget to do God's commandments. Take a look what I mean in Deuteronomy chapter 8.
Verse 11, Beware that you forget not Yehovah thy God, and not keeping his commandments and his judgments and his statutes, which I command thee this day. In verse 17, And thou say in thine heart, My power and the might of mine hand hath gotten me this wealth. But thou shalt remember that Yehovah thy God, for it is he that giveth thee power to get wealth, that he may establish his covenant which he sware unto thy fathers, as it is this day. And it shall be, if you do at all forget Yehovah thy God, and walk after other gods, and serve them, and worship them, I testify you against this day that you shall surely perish.
So the reason this letter is somewhat discreet in the way that it says, I have somewhat against thee, because this is the term that is being used throughout the law of God about sinning through ignorance. The very chapter of Leviticus chapter 4 is speaking about sins that were taken through ignorance. Most of the church today is not aware that they are idolatrous. They have not awoken yet to this truth yet, but that's why God judges us based off our heart. And that's what this day is about, is to wake us up and to realize that we have left Yehovah our God and we have worshipped another God. Take a look at the sinning through ignorance in Leviticus chapter 4.
Verse 13, If the whole congregation sin through ignorance, and the thing be hid from the eyes of the assembly, and they have done somewhat against the commandments of Yehovah concerning the thing which not should be done, and are guilty. In verse 22, When a ruler has sinned and hath done somewhat through ignorance against any of the commandments of Yehovah his God concerning the thing which should not be done, and is guilty. And then lastly, verse 27, And if any one of the common people sin through ignorance, while he doeth somewhat against any of the commandments of Yehovah concerning the things which ought not be done, and be guilty.
And this is the idea of what sinning somewhat through ignorance is pertaining to. And this was Peter's problem. This is what Jesus was alluding to himself when he said, You'll deny me 3 times before the cock crowed twice. But this is also why Jesus said that when you are converted, Go and help your brethren.
Luke 22, verse 31, and the Lord said, Simon, Simon, behold, Satan hath desired to have you, that he may sift you as wheat. But I have prayed for thee, that thy faith fail not. And when you are converted, strengthen thy brethren. And he said unto him, Lord, I am ready to go with thee, both into prison and to death. And he said, I tell you, Peter, the cock shall not crow this day before thou shalt deny thrice that you knowest me.
So what does he mean when he says, when you are converted, strengthen your brethren? Take a look at Psalm 19, verse 7.
The law of the Lord is perfect, converting the soul. The testimony of Yehovah is sure, making wise the simple. The statutes of Yehovah are right, rejoicing the heart. The commandment of Yehovah is pure, enlightening the eyes.
So this is exactly what he is telling Peter in a dark sentence and in a parabolic meaning, saying you need to turn back to Yehovah your God, your first love, Yehovah, and keep the first 4 commandments that pertain to loving him. These are the things that you have left off. Because the very first commandment states, I am Yehovah thy God from the land of Egypt. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not bow down to anything that has a representation or similitude, anything of male or female. You shall not take my name in vain. And lastly, you shall keep my Sabbaths, keep them holy. It's a sign between me and you for all generations that I'm the one that sanctifies you. These are the first 4 commandments, and these are the 4 commandments that pertain to the love of God. If we're not doing these, then we have left our first love. That is what this means. That is all the church member lacks today. That's the illusion being given. What's being stated many times here in the Gospels is that we need to be able to forsake all that we have. And as the Maccabees did at the time when they were persecuted, when they were threatened with the idea of either forsaking God and not keeping his commandments, they were willing to die the death. They loved not their lives until death. They were faithful to the covenant up until the point of death. And are you willing to do this? Are you willing to do that at this time? There will not a hair of your head perish. When you deny Jesus in word and take upon the covenant and keep the commandments just as Jesus did, you will be denying him in word, but not in action. And that is the test. Will you be faithful and keep the covenant in action rather than saying and not doing? And this is the test for the whole world. But fear not. The name of Yehovah is a strong tower, and the righteous run to it and are safe. That's Proverbs 18, verse 10. So it's somewhat against you in this church because it's done through ignorance. Worship your Father in heaven, your first love. Call no man on earth your Father in heaven. One is your Father in heaven, and that is God. His name is Yehovah. And this is the idea being presented in John chapter 3, that you must be born again. Just as when you were born into this world of water and you obey your earthly father, so should you do so if you make Yehovah your Father in heaven. You would take upon his covenant that he gave you, that you may be a son of God. He that overcometh shall inherit all things, and I will be his God, and he shall be my son. It's Revelation 21:7, as I've used many a times to understand and help people understand what it means to overcome. And this is the test that is right before our eyes. If we will overcome, if we take upon his covenant and obey his voice, then we will be sons of his.
Joel chapter 2, verse 27, and ye shall know that I am in the midst of Israel, and that I am Yehovah your God, and none else, and my people shall never be ashamed. Joel 2:32, for whosoever shall call upon the name of Yehovah shall be delivered, for in Mount Zion shall be deliverance, and the remnant in whom he shall call.
I just want you to remember one thing. God will not test you beyond that which you are able. There's always another path that you may not see.
Where are you going?
Another way. Always another way.
This is what Paul is secretly alluding to if you look at 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13 through 15. Wherefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. I speak unto wise men, judge what I say. So when you think that there's no other way to turn, and you are afraid to deny Jesus in word, if you are putting away idolatry and keeping God's covenant and calling upon his name, you are taking upon his covenant, and this is the other path. This is our test. So I just want that to be an encouragement to you, that if the day comes that you have to do that, then I don't want you to be worried. God will have you protected just as he did in Daniel, that not a hair of his head perished, and he did not worship the golden image. That is what the test is going to be now, and while we wait it out, we have to be patient and wait out the time to the redemption. So again, I thank you for watching, and I'll see you again on another video.